The inward curve. This is your pattern piece. As you can see, we have a variety of seam allowances around the edges. This is what your finished sample is going to look like. We have this nice curve here. And on the inside, you can see the beautiful trimming, grading, and clipping. And this clipping allows the seam to relax. That seam allowance needs to splay out in order to make that curve. We're going to use 2 pieces of muslin. We have 0 inches of seam allowance here. So we're going to snug up our pattern piece right to the edge just so we don't have to cut any fabric off of those edges. Mark those notches. And at the top edge, we need a 1/2 inch of seam allowance. And the side edge. But along our stitch line, we're going to need 1 inch of seam allowance. And that's to accommodate the tricky sewing and in order to deal with all of the clipping that we're going to need to do. So I'm going to use my finger to mark on the ruler where 1 inch is. And then I'm just going to keep my finger there as I move along, making dashes as I go. Now this is an example of how you can connect the dashed lines with your pencil. As you get a hang of this, you won't need to do that anymore. You only need to make a dash as close together as necessary in order to connect that line. We're going to continue our 1/2 inch of seam allowance up to our 1 inch of seam allowance. And then we're ready to cut. And as we need 2 pieces of this pattern, we flipped it over. I'm going to follow the same steps on the other side. This is an example of making dashes only as close as needed. Cut out our second sample piece. We're going to lay right sides together. And now we start pinning. As you can see, we've done a combination of perpendicular and parallel pinning. We are going to sew this sample on a 3 stitch length, back stitching right at the stitch line, but starting our sewing in the seam allowance. Now you're just going to take your time so that you have a nice smooth curve, pulling out your parallel pins only as you need to, right when you get to them. Just pulling out a little bit at a time. That's why you take those little bites, because that pin acts as a basting stitch essentially, and it's holding the fabric perfectly in place until you move it out a little bit at a time. Now you can orientate your fabric, lifting your presser foot with the needle down and moving your fabric so that it is the most convenient for your sewing. Remember, you are in control. I'm going to back stitch at the end, but sew all the way through to the end of the seam allowance. Cut our threads, and now we check our work. We hit our line on this side, and fantastic, we hit it on the other side as well. Now we take it to the iron, and we are going to press our stitching as usual. We love pressing our stitching. Now we trim our seam allowance. Since our seam allowance is 1 inch long and we want it to be 1/2 inch long, we can just cut it down the middle. Next up is grading. So we are going to cut the top seam allowance only to 1/4 of an inch. So once again, we can just cut it down the middle. Cutting it in half. Now for the clipping. So for clipping, on the straight parts of your curve, you're going to do something different than you do in the middle where it is tighter in the curve. So on the straight parts, you only need to clip every 1/2 inch, and you're clipping right to the stitching, but not through the stitching. And when you get to the tight part of the curve, you're going to clip every 1/4 of an inch. Now we are going to turn our sample right side out. It's going to want to fight you a little bit. You're going to have to kind of train it to do what you want it to do. So turning back on that seam. Now I'm going to use steam from the iron, no pressure, just steam, to aid me in being able to roll that fabric right to the edge of the seam. So I'm going to finger roll the fabric to be exactly where I want it to be, so we have a nice crisp edge and there are no tacos. See, this is what a taco would look like, where fabric is pushing past the seam line. And you do not want to iron that crease into your fabric. So you want to make sure that you have it perfectly orientated before you apply heat and steam and pressure. And there you have it, a very crisp seam edge. And you look inside, you can see how much the seam allowance is splaying out like that sunbeam, and that your clips are allowing it to do so. And that is what has enabled your sample to lay nice and flat like that. Well done!